Tim Brown from IDEO, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk, maybe take a slightly different tack to the topic, although touch on one or two of the same things that John just talked about. We should talk a little bit about design and perhaps the way that, looking through a design lens, we can see some changes that are happening in the world when it comes to tackling the challenges of complexity. Herbert Simon did a great job of defining what design is back in the 1960s when he described it as design being anyone who designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. In other words, attempting to make the state of the world better. And we've taken essentially the same approach to design for literally hundreds of thousands of years since we started doing this kind of stuff, when we started shaping the world around us to better meet our needs. And those early examples of shaping were literally shaping pieces of stone to make tools. And as each chip was removed from the stone by the craftsman, so that tool was better suited to the world in which it was being designed to exist in. And we've essentially taken this approach ever since. And that approach works very well for simple things. It works very well for stone tools. It works very well for products, even as complex as things like automobiles. And it works quite well for things even at the built scale. But it doesn't necessarily work so well when we get to things that are very complex. And perhaps the first thing that we started to create a civilization that was beyond our ability to shape in the way that those early stone craftsmen shaped their world was the city. The city is too complex for us to be able to shape it in quite that way. And I would suggest that the vast majority of businesses are rather more like cities than they are like stone hand axes, that they're too complex to shape in the way that we might think we've traditionally designed, which leaves a bit of a quandary for those who are supposed to be shaping the organization. It leaves a little bit of a quandary for people like CEOs. How should they design the organizations that they're responsible for? Well, I suggest what we need is a shift in approach, and a shift that's best represented by referring to two quite well-known scientists. And I will forgive me if they're both British, but I can't help trying to promote British science when I can. The first of whom, relatively well-known, a chap by the name of Isaac Newton. And I think most of our approaches to design historically and to the way that we shape our world are essentially Newtonian. They're based on this notion that we can understand the present to such a degree that we can predict the future, which is exactly what Newton's laws do. Right? And again, Newton's laws work very well, but only at relatively simple levels. They don't work so very well when we get to complexity. But there's another relatively old, relatively famous British scientist who I think took a different approach to complexity, Charles Darwin, who opened up for all of us the possibility that we can see complexity emerging, the bottom-up evolution, iteration, no top-down control, no attempt to predict the future is actually a different way of looking at the world, and particularly looking at the world, the biological world around us. And I'd suggest that, in fact, it's a useful way also to think in terms of design. And that we're seeing approaches to design, approaches to the way we might shape our world that are based on more evolutionary ideas. And it means letting go of some of the kind of icons of design, I mean, one of which you might think of as the blueprint. That moment when we freeze the design of whatever it is we do, that we decide that the blueprint represents everything about our final design, frozen in a moment. And the blueprint can be an organizational chart, or it can be like this, the blueprint of a building, or a blueprint of a product. We have to let go of this idea that we can freeze the design of things, and perhaps move to the notion that in fact what we're doing when we design is coding things. that we're establishing behaviors through what we do that will play out in only somewhat predictable ways, not in entirely predictable ways, and where we will not have frozen every aspect of the design at any given moment. So I think there are two ways in which this shift from a sort of top-down Newtonian view of how we shape our world to a Darwinian view, there are two ways that this is playing out, both of which I think are relevant to how we think about our organizations and how we respond to complexity. One is the idea that who is the designer? Well, in fact, I'd actually suggest both of these ideas are about, ask questions about who is the designer. But the design moves perhaps from that single dominant top-down figure, perhaps the CEO, to everybody in the organization. We move from some designers to many designers, if not everyone being a designer. Whereas Chris Anderson, this is the Wired magazine, Chris Anderson talked about the idea that everybody is a designer now, and we really should try to get good at it. And there are ways that we can do that. We can institute and spread and share the tools of design, which might be described as design thinking, and have them apply not just to the products and services that we make in our organizations, not just to the processes that we use within our organizations, but as John just talked about, the very organizations and institutions themselves, that we can apply the tools of design to how we conceive of these things. But also, we need to apply the mindset of design. And one way of describing that is talked about in a book that's just been published by my colleague David Kelly, Creative Confidence. Because what really prevents most of us in most organizations participating in the creation of new things, in the design of the world around us, is actually fear. It's fear of failure. It's a fear of the lack of the tools that it takes to successfully design something. And so I believe that what we need to do in all of our organizations is increase the creative confidence of our organizations and make available the tools of design in order that we begin to code our cultures, our organizational cultures, to be creative, adaptive, and innovative. The second way in which this is playing out, the second strategy in which I believe organizations need to think about applying, is one based on a topic that's been talked about already several times this morning, which is leveraging the power of these new networks, best represented perhaps by the internet, that we have available to us today. Stephen Johnson talks about the evolution of peer networks and the impact that they're having on our economies, I think very successfully in his book, Future Perfect. I would recommend taking a look at it. And what he does is describe the evolution of the kinds of networks that we've used in business, in society, as they've moved from essentially centralized networks. He used the example of Legrand networks, which is based after the designer of the French railway system, where every railway goes through Paris, efficient but not very adaptable. To over on the right-hand side there, to Baran networks, which are the design that is used for the internet. And he talks mostly about how this has led to things like the sharing economy that we see today, this ability for people to collaborate in new kinds of ways. But we're also seeing it in the world of innovation and design. And we're seeing networks emerge that are essentially democratizing creativity and design and innovation very rapidly and making it available to many more kinds of people. And I think what really matters here is we start to think about going outside the kind of boundaries of the organization, because these networks are now out there kind of competing, if you like, with our own organizations. And we're seeing it playing out in different ways with networks like Pinterest, where now anybody has access to the kinds of inspirations that only professional designers had just a few years ago. Perhaps most clearly Kickstarter, which is allowing individual or small teams of creative people to compete head-to-head with the world's largest corporations in a way that was clearly extremely difficult to do not so very long ago. We have open design platforms. This is one that we happen to build ourselves at IDEO, where we have 50,000 people now collaborating around the world, tackling social innovation challenges. And all kinds of institutions, in the way that John was mentioning, are beginning to reach out outside of themselves and using these networks in order to create new ideas, new inspirations, new strategies. We're seeing this playing out not just in the world of ideas, but also in the ways that ideas get executed and implemented. 3D printing is just one of the technologies that's democratizing innovation and design in new and interesting ways. And we will no doubt, and we're already beginning to see the sort of centralized power of traditional industrial manufacturing begin to get eroded by these new technologies. And new kinds of companies are emerging as a result, one of which is an organization called Local Motors that's appeared in the United States relatively recently, that using a crowdsourced design methodology has developed off-road vehicles, including ones for the US military, in a mere fraction of the time that it takes conventional automobile companies or defense contractors to develop the same vehicles. And they're being manufactured locally in these micro factories that are designed only at the scale necessary to serve the local market. So this idea that through using these platforms we can develop new ideas more rapidly and we can disseminate them out into the marketplace more rapidly is one of the results, I think, of this sort of emergent approach to design. So just to kind of summarize, Paul Sappho described three kind of ages of the economy of the last couple of hundred years, and he talked about the 19th century being the industrial economy driven by the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century being the consumer economy principally driven by the innovations of mass media, and that the 21st century is something that we might think of as the creator economy, driven by the kinds of innovations that these platforms are making possible, where everybody is a contributor, a participant in the kind of creative output of our economy. That means everybody in the organization and everybody out in the world, that all of us have a role in production as well as consumption. And I think it's by unleashing the potential of this much greater level of participation that we might see the possibility of navigating some of the complexities that have been described this morning. Thanks a lot.